Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Evan Michael Hartley was born on January 9, 2019, in the coastal city of Bayport, South Carolina, to parents Marissa Cole and Jonathan Hartley. He was the second of 4 children born to the couple over a short span of time. An older brother had been born in late 2017, and less than 2 years after Evan's birth, Marissa gave birth to twin boys. Friends of the family would later say that the household always felt crowded, chaotic, and strained, even during moments that were meant to be joyful. Evan was remembered as a quiet but observant child. He had thick, dark curls that never quite lay flat and large hazel eyes that seemed to study the room before he moved. When he smiled, dimples formed deep in his cheeks, giving him a softness that made strangers linger a moment longer when they passed him in grocery store aisles. He loved toy cars and superhero cartoons, especially anything involving capes or masks. His favorite shoes were plastic flip-flops decorated with lightning bolts, which he insisted on wearing even when the weather was cold. Marissa and Jonathan never married. Their relationship was volatile from the beginning, marked by frequent breakups and reconciliations. Police records would later show multiple calls to their residence for domestic disturbances, though few resulted in formal charges. Friends said the two were drawn together by familiarity rather than affection, and when they finally separated for good in early 2020, it was less an agreement than an exhaustion. By mid-2020, Marissa's health began to decline. She suffered from a combination of physical illness and untreated mental health struggles that left her frequently hospitalized. With no stable housing and limited support, she and Jonathan made the decision that the children would go live with him temporarily while she recovered. According to Marissa, the arrangement was supposed to be short-term. She believed she would see the children regularly and remain involved in their lives. That did not happen. On November 6, 2020, Marissa met Jonathan in a parking lot off a highway rest stop outside Florence, roughly halfway between Bayport and the city of Raleigh, where Marissa had recently relocated. She hugged each child tightly before watching Jonathan load them into his vehicle. Evan, not yet 2 years old, cried as she handed him over, clinging to her coat. Jonathan stood several feet away, avoiding eye contact, urging her to hurry. That was the last time Marissa saw her children in person. In the months that followed, communication became sporadic. Jonathan refused to give Marissa his home address, telling her it was not safe for visits. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were left on read. When she did manage to speak with the children, it was brief, often limited to birthdays or holidays. Evan rarely spoke during these calls. He seemed subdued, sometimes staring off screen as if distracted by something in the room. Jonathan lived in a 2-story townhouse in the Harbor Ridge complex, a dense cluster of rental units built in the early 2000s near the Bayport shipyards. Neighbors described him as private and rarely seen. Curtains were often drawn. The children almost never played outside. No one recalled seeing them attend daycare or preschool. On the morning of February 14, 2022, Jonathan Hartley called 911 just after 8:45 a.m. His voice on the call was measured but tense. He told the dispatcher that his 4-year-old son, Evan, was missing. He said he had last seen him during the night, sometime after putting him to bed. When he woke up that morning, Evan was gone. Jonathan claimed he searched the house before calling police. Officers from the Bayport Police Department arrived at the Harbor Ridge complex within minutes. They spoke with Jonathan inside the townhouse while other officers canvassed the immediate area. According to the initial report, Jonathan appeared calm but evasive. He could not clearly state when Evan had last been seen, offering different time frames within the same conversation. He struggled to describe what Evan had been wearing, eventually suggesting the child might have been wearing his flip-flops because they were missing from the front door. Police quickly issued a public alert. Evan was described as approximately 3 feet tall, with dark curly hair and hazel eyes. Volunteers began to gather within hours. Many were residents of Bayport who remembered another missing child case from several years earlier that had ended tragically. The similarity weighed heavily on the community. By the next day, state investigators and federal agents had joined the search. More than 60 volunteers combed wooded areas, drainage ditches, and nearby construction sites. Canine units were brought in. Drones flew overhead. Despite the scale of the operation, there was no trace of Evan. During a press briefing on February 15th, Bayport Police Chief Ronald Ives confirmed that both parents were considered persons of interest. He stated that evidence collected did not align with Jonathan's account of events, but declined to elaborate. He emphasized that there was no indication of an abduction, which meant the case did not meet the criteria for a statewide child alert. Chief Ives also confirmed that investigators were searching water sources in the area, including retention ponds and industrial runoff channels near the shipyards. When pressed by reporters, he acknowledged that waste processing facilities were being examined as part of standard protocol in missing child cases. Police also turned to social media, posting a series of direct questions. Had anyone seen Evan or his siblings in recent months? Did any residents of Harbor Ridge ask surveillance cameras? Had anyone interacted with Jonathan Hartley since the holidays? Tips began to trickle in, though most led nowhere. Jonathan remained at the police station for extended interviews. His sister, Danielle Hartley, spoke briefly with local media. She insisted her brother loved his children and would never harm them. She described him as strict but gentle, saying he didn't even believe in spanking. She dismissed inconsistencies in his statements as stress and exhaustion. On February 17th, Jonathan was arrested on multiple counts of child neglect unrelated to Evan's disappearance. Court documents alleged that he had left the children home alone on several occasions, sometimes for hours, without supervision or access to emergency assistance. Investigators stated that these incidents occurred in the weeks leading up to Evan being reported missing. Jonathan's attorney was quick to clarify that the charges were not directly connected to Evan's case. Still, the arrest shifted public perception. The remaining children were removed from the home and placed into protective custody. As days passed, hope began to fade. Volunteers continued searching despite freezing rain and muddy terrain. A candlelight vigil was held at a nearby soccer field. Children released balloons into the sky, while adults stood in silence, holding candles that flickered in the wind. A hand-painted sign appeared near the entrance to Harbor Ridge. It read simply, "Evan, come home." Behind the scenes, investigators were uncovering troubling information. Records showed that Evan had not been seen by a doctor or enrolled in any educational program since early 2020. Neighbors confirmed that they had not seen him outside in months. One resident recalled hearing a child crying late at night during the previous summer, though they could not be certain which child it was. On February 22nd, a small blue jacket was found in a field behind the townhouse complex. Tire impressions were discovered nearby. The jacket was consistent with one Evan had been seen in older photographs. Forensic teams secured the area, but officials cautioned the public not to draw conclusions. Marissa Cole released a written statement thanking the community for their efforts. She asked for privacy and said she was praying for her son's safe return. Privately, she told investigators that Jonathan once emailed her expressing fear that he might lose control around Evan. That message, months before Evan was reported missing, would become a key piece of evidence. By the end of February, the case had shifted from a missing child investigation to something far darker. Though no remains had been found, detectives quietly began working under the assumption that Evan had not wandered away on his own. And for the first time since the search began, investigators started asking not where Evan went, but when he was last truly seen alive. By the end of February, investigators were no longer organizing large volunteer searches. The tone around the case had shifted. Publicly, authorities continued to say they were pursuing every lead. Privately, the focus narrowed almost entirely to the Harbor Ridge townhouse and to Jonathan Hartley. Digital forensics became the priority. Detectives obtained search warrants for Jonathan's phone, laptop, vehicle GPS system, and financial records. What they found did not support his version of events. Jonathan had told officers that he went to bed around midnight on February 13 and discovered Evan missing at approximately 8:30 the following morning. However, phone data showed activity on his device at 2:17 a.m., 3:42 a.m., and again at 5:11 a.m. One of those searches included the phrase, "How long before a missing child is presumed dead?" Another asked about decomposition in winter temperatures. When confronted, Jonathan claimed he could not remember making those searches and suggested someone else may have used his phone. Detectives noted that his device required fingerprint authentication. Investigators also reviewed surveillance footage from surrounding streets. At 5:58 a.m. on February 14, a vehicle matching Jonathan's silver SUV was seen exiting the Harbor Ridge complex. It returned at 6:12 a.m. Jonathan had never mentioned leaving the home that morning. When asked about it during a follow-up interview, he said he went out to clear his head because he had been arguing with one of the children earlier in the night. He maintained that Evan was alive and asleep when he left. The other children, now in protective custody, were interviewed by child forensic specialists. Their statements were fragmented, age-appropriate, and at times difficult to interpret. One of the older siblings reportedly told a caseworker that Evan had been in trouble the night before he disappeared. Another mentioned that their father had been very mad and that Evan had been crying for a long time. Medical professionals who examined the siblings documented bruising in various stages of healing. None were life-threatening, but the pattern suggested repeated physical discipline. Combined with the neglect charges already filed, the picture emerging inside the townhouse was troubling. Meanwhile, investigators processed the interior of the home. Forensic teams removed sections of carpet from Evan's bedroom and from the upstairs hallway. They collected bedding, clothing, and cleaning supplies found under the kitchen sink. Luminol testing revealed areas that reacted positively for what investigators believed could be blood traces, though confirmation required lab analysis. Jonathan's behavior in custody drew attention. Jail staff noted that he frequently asked other inmates about how long police could hold someone without a body. He attempted to contact his sister several times, urging her to stick to the story that he was a patient and gentle parent. Those calls were recorded. On March 3rd, investigators executed a search warrant on a rural property approximately 40 miles outside Bayport. GPS data from Jonathan's vehicle showed that he had traveled there multiple times in the early morning hours during the weeks prior to Evan's disappearance. The property was a wooded area near an abandoned storage facility. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Ground-penetrating radar was used in several spots. Nothing conclusive was found. The lack of physical evidence complicated the case. Prosecutors were hesitant to file homicide charges without remains or a definite cause of death. However, the circumstantial evidence continued to build. Financial records showed that Jonathan had withdrawn a significant amount of cash 2 days before reporting Evan missing. Investigators could not determine how the money was used. They also discovered that he had purchased heavy-duty trash bags, bleach, and contractor-grade gloves within a 48-hour window surrounding the disappearance. When questioned about those purchases, Jonathan said they were for general household cleaning. Detectives pointed out that no significant cleaning had been documented in the home prior to February 14, and the house remained cluttered and unsanitary at the time officers first responded. Marissa Cole traveled to Bayport in early March after being informed that the investigation was escalating. She met with detectives for nearly 6 hours. During that meeting, she provided additional context about Jonathan's temperament. She described him as unpredictable, prone to sudden anger, particularly when the children were noisy or disobedient. She said he struggled most with Evan, who, while generally quiet, had begun asserting himself more as he approached 4 years old. Marissa also disclosed that Jonathan once told her he felt overwhelmed caring for 4 children alone and had said, "Sometimes I wish one of them would just disappear." At the time, she interpreted the statement as frustration. In hindsight, she said it haunted her. Public attention intensified after local media obtained court documents detailing the neglect charges. Community members began leaving stuffed animals and handwritten notes outside the police department. Social media speculation grew more aggressive. Some called for immediate murder charges. Others cautioned against trial by public opinion. Chief Ives held another press conference on March 10th. He confirmed that investigators believed foul play was involved in Evan's disappearance. He did not use the word homicide, but the implication was clear. He urged anyone with information, no matter how minor it seemed, to come forward. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began presenting evidence to a grand jury. They focused on the digital searches, the unexplained early morning drive, the purchase of cleaning materials, and the inconsistencies in Jonathan's timeline. They also highlighted the forensic findings from the townhouse, including the presumptive blood reactions in Evan's bedroom. On March 18th, nearly 5 weeks after Evan was reported missing, the grand jury returned an indictment charging Jonathan with second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The charges were filed despite the absence of a body. Jonathan was formally arraigned the following day. He pledged not guilty. His attorney argued that the prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial and driven by public pressure. He insisted there was no proof that Evan was dead, let alone that Jonathan had caused his death. The indictment marked a turning point. The search for a missing child had become a homicide prosecution. In the weeks that followed, pre-trial hearings revealed additional details. Forensic analysis confirmed that blood found in Evan's bedroom matched his DNA. The quantity, while not massive, was inconsistent with a minor childhood injury. Investigators also recovered microscopic fibers in Jonathan's SUV that matched the carpeting removed from the townhouse hallway. Perhaps most damaging was newly uncovered cell phone location data. On the morning of February 14th, between 5:03 a.m. and 5:47 a.m., Jonathan's phone pinged off a tower near the mouth of the Bayport Industrial Canal, a waterway connected to the Atlantic through a series of shipping channels. The area was remote, accessible by a gravel service road, and bordered by marshland. When confronted with this information, Jonathan claimed he had driven aimlessly and stopped only briefly to check his phone. He denied disposing of anything in the canal. Search efforts shifted accordingly. Dive teams conducted multiple sweeps of the canal and adjacent marshes. Sonar equipment scanned the murky water. Weeks passed with no recovery. As spring turned to early summer, the case settled into the slow rhythm of pre-trial litigation. Defense attorneys filed motions to suppress certain digital evidence, arguing improper warrant procedures. Prosecutors countered with detailed affidavits outlining probable cause. Meanwhile, Marissa returned to Raleigh, carrying with her the weight of uncertainty. she spoke publicly only once more, stating that she believed her son was gone, but that she wanted the truth, whatever it was, presented in court. Jonathan remained in county jail without bond. The absence of a body continued to loom over the proceedings. Prosecutors knew that securing a conviction without remains would require a cohesive narrative supported by forensic science, digital evidence, and credible witness testimony. They would need to demonstrate that Evan was not only dead, but that Jonathan had intentionally caused that death and then attempted to conceal it. By late summer, trial dates were being discussed. Jury selection would likely begin early the following year. And although no one had yet recovered Evan Michael Hartley, investigators were preparing to argue that the evidence told a story on its own, one of anger, isolation, and a single early morning drive that ended a 4-year-old child's life. Jury selection began in early February the following year, almost 12 months to the day after Evan had been reported missing. The courtroom in Bayport was filled beyond capacity on the first morning of trial. Reporters lined the back wall. Members of the community, who had once walked search grids in freezing rain, now sat quietly in the gallery, waiting for answers. The prosecution's theory was direct. They argued that sometime late on the night of February 13th, Jonathan Hartley lost his temper with his 4-year-old son. What began as punishment escalated into fatal violence. Realizing what he had done, Jonathan waited until the early morning hours, transported Evan's body in his SUV, and disposed of him in or near the Bayport Industrial Canal. He then returned home and constructed a missing child narrative. The defense offered a different framing. They insisted there was no body, no eyewitness, and no definitive cause of death. They characterized the state's case as a chain of assumptions built on circumstantial evidence and fueled by public pressure. Jonathan, they said, was a flawed but devoted father who panicked when his son wandered off during the night. Opening statements set the tone. Prosecutors walked jurors through the timeline minute by minute. They projected phone records onto a large screen, highlighting the early morning internet searches. They showed surveillance stills of Jonathan's SUV leaving Harbor Ridge before dawn. They introduced photographs of the townhouse interior, including Evan's bedroom. The defense countered by emphasizing reasonable doubt. They pointed out that no neighbor reported hearing a violent altercation. They argued that the luminol reactions in the bedroom did not conclusively prove a fatal injury occurred there. They suggested that the SUV's early morning trip could have been exactly what Jonathan claimed, a drive to clear his head. Over the next 3 weeks, the jury heard from more than 40 witnesses. Digital forensic analysts testified first. They explained how Jonathan's phone had been active throughout the night and detailed the search history. One analyst clarified that the searches about decomposition and presumed death were not auto-filled suggestions, but manually entered phrases. The timestamps placed them before Jonathan called 911. Under cross-examination, the defense attempted to suggest that someone else could have used the phone. The analyst responded that the device required biometric authentication and that there was no evidence of unauthorized access. Next came the surveillance footage. A technician authenticated video showing the silver SUV exiting Harbor Ridge at 4:58 a.m. and returning shortly after 6 a.m. The prosecution paired that footage with cell tower data, placing Jonathan's phone near the industrial canal during that window. Perhaps the most emotionally difficult testimony came from the forensic biologist. She explained that DNA analysis confirmed blood recovered from Evan's bedroom carpet matched his genetic profile. The quantity, she stated carefully, was consistent with a significant bleeding event. She stopped short of speculating about the exact mechanism, but noted that it exceeded what would typically result from a minor fall or scraped knee. Jurors were shown close-up photographs of the removed carpet sections. Several looked away. The prosecution also called the pediatric specialist who had examined Evan's siblings after they were removed from the home. She testified about bruising patterns that indicated repeated physical discipline. While she could not testify about Evan specifically, she stated that the injuries on the other children were consistent with force beyond ordinary spanking. Marissa Cole took the stand midway through the trial. She appeared composed but visibly strained. She recounted the parking lot exchange in November 2020, the last time she had held her son. She described Jonathan's escalating frustration during their relationship and repeated the statement he once made about wishing one of the children would disappear. The courtroom was silent as she spoke. On cross-examination, the defense questioned her about her own health struggles and the decision to allow the children to live with Jonathan. She acknowledged those challenges, but maintained that she never believed her children were in mortal danger. Jonathan's sister testified for the defense. She described him as overwhelmed but loving. She said he frequently called her for parenting advice and had never expressed hatred toward Evan. When prosecutors played a recorded jail call in which Jonathan urged her to stick to the story, her voice faltered. She said she interpreted that statement as fear of being misunderstood, not an attempt to coordinate false testimony. After the state rested, the defense made a strategic decision that surprised some observers. Jonathan Hartley would testify. He took the stand in a gray suit, hands folded tightly. His voice was steady at first. He maintained that Evan had been alive when he went to bed and that he discovered him missing in the morning. He admitted to driving early that day, but insisted he did not dispose of his son. He claimed the internet searches were the result of panic after realizing Evan was gone. Under cross-examination, prosecutors pressed him on inconsistencies. Why had he not mentioned the early morning drive during his initial 911 call? Why did he purchase heavy-duty trash bags and bleach days before reporting Evan missing? Why had no neighbor seen Evan outside for months? Jonathan struggled with several answers. At one point, he contradicted his earlier testimony about when he last physically checked on Evan. The prosecutor replayed portions of his recorded police interview, highlighting the discrepancies. The most tense moment came when the prosecutor asked directly, "Isn't it true that you lost control that night?" Jonathan paused for several seconds before responding, "No." Closing arguments lasted nearly 6 hours combined. The prosecution argued that while there was no body, the evidence formed a coherent and unavoidable conclusion. They reminded jurors that homicide cases without remains were rare but not unprecedented. They emphasized the digital trail, the blood evidence, the early morning drive, and the pattern of escalating anger. The defense urged jurors to resist emotional reasoning. They reiterated that absence of proof was not proof of guilt. They argued that the state could not demonstrate how Evan died, when he died, or where his body was located. After deliberating for 4 full days, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent as the forepersons stood. On the charge of second-degree murder, the verdict was guilty. On tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice, guilty on both counts. Jonathan Hartley showed little visible reaction. Marissa lowered her head and wept quietly. Several weeks later, during sentencing, the judge addressed the absence that had defined the case. He acknowledged that no punishment could fully account for the loss of a child whose body had never been recovered. He described the crime as an ultimate betrayal of parental responsibility. Jonathan was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. In the months following the trial, search efforts quietly continued in the marshlands near the Bayport Industrial Canal. Volunteers occasionally organized small private searches on anniversaries and birthdays. No remains were ever found. A memorial bench now sits in a small park overlooking the water, placed there by community members. It bears Evan's name and a simple inscription about bright eyes and lightning bolt shoes. For Marissa, closure remains incomplete. There is no gravesite to visit, no confirmed resting place, only the certainty delivered by 12 jurors who concluded that the evidence told the truth. The case changed Bayport. It altered how local agencies monitored isolated families and how schools and healthcare providers flagged prolonged absences. It forced conversations about parental stress, domestic volatility, and the unseen dangers that can exist behind closed doors. But for those who remember the 4-year-old with dark curls and quiet dimples, the legal outcome is only part of the story. What remains most vivid are the small details: toy cars scattered on a bedroom floor, flip-flops by the door, and a child who once insisted on wearing lightning bolts even when the weather turned cold. And though the canal water continues to move with the tides, carrying secrets into the Atlantic, the memory of Evan Michael Hartley does not fade with it. Elijah Mateo Cruz was born on November 14, 2018 in Mesa Verde, Arizona, to parents Adrian Cruz and Marisol Vega. From the beginning, people described him as an unusually gentle child. He had tight black curls that framed his round face and wide, curious hazel eyes that seemed to take everything in. In photographs, he was almost always smiling, sometimes shyly, sometimes with a grin that showed all his baby teeth at once. He was the kind of toddler who waved at strangers in grocery store lines and clung to his stuffed dinosaur when he felt unsure. Marisol used to say that Elijah's favorite word was again. He loved repetition. Again with the music, again with the bubbles, again with the cartoon theme song he insisted on hearing over and over. His favorite character was a bright red race car from an animated series he watched on a tablet. He adored macaroni and cheese, strawberries, and little boxes of apple juice. He would sway side to side when music played, his tiny sneakers squeaking on the tile floor of their apartment. An old friend of Marisol's, Rafael Ortiz, who had dated her briefly before Elijah turned 1, once said, "He wasn't a fussy baby. If he cried, something was wrong. He didn't cry just to cry." Rafael remembered Elijah as observant and calm, the type of toddler who would sit quietly stacking blocks while other children ran in circles. Adrian and Marisol's relationship had ended long before Elijah's first birthday. They had never truly settled into life as a couple. Arguments had come quickly and often. Marisol later confided to friends that Adrian had a temper, that during her pregnancy there had been shouting matches that left her shaken. Adrian denied ever hurting her, but the hostility between them never really faded. Communication became rare and strained. Though Marisol had primary custody, Adrian occasionally asked about visiting Elijah around holidays. He would send messages asking for pictures or short video calls. Sometimes Marisol responded, sometimes she didn't. Trust between them had eroded to almost nothing. By early 2021, Marisol had started a new relationship with a man named Darius Coleman. Darius was older than her by nearly a decade and had recently been released from prison after serving time for burglary and aggravated assault. He carried himself with confidence, sometimes bordering on defiance. To Marisol, he seemed protective. To others, he seemed volatile. They lived together in a budget extended stay complex called Desert Palm Suites, just off a busy highway lined with gas stations and chain restaurants. The building was faded beige stucco with narrow exterior hallways and doors that opened directly to the parking lot. Residents came and went at all hours. It was not the sort of place where neighbors asked too many questions. Marisol's mother, Elena Vega, had strong reservations about Darius from the beginning. She had known of him years earlier through mutual acquaintances and remembered stories about fights and police calls. Elena warned her daughter gently at first, then more urgently. "You have to think about Elijah," she would say, "not just yourself." Marisol brushed off the concern. She insisted Darius was misunderstood, that he was trying to rebuild his life. She said he was good with Elijah, that he played cards on the floor with him and made him laugh. But Elena noticed bruises once on Elijah's arm during a video call. Marisol blamed a fall in the parking lot. In June 2020, a call was made to the Maricopa County Child and Family Support Services hotline. The caller reported suspected neglect and possible physical abuse. An investigator visited the Desert Palms unit. According to later records, the apartment was cluttered but not deemed hazardous. The case was closed within a few weeks. There was no mandatory drug testing, no follow-up home visits scheduled. Elena was furious when she learned how quickly the case had been dismissed. She believed the system had barely scratched the surface. They didn't look hard enough, she told relatives. They didn't ask the right questions. In April 2021, Elena suffered a severe injury after being knocked down by a neighbor's large dog. She required surgery on her ankle and could not walk without assistance. Marisol decided to travel to Prescott Valley, a small mountain town 3 hours north, to help her recover. Initially, the plan was for Elijah to go with her. Elena had even bought an extra bus ticket and prepared a small bed in her living room. But days before the trip, Marisol changed her mind. She told her mother that traveling with a toddler would be difficult. Darius offered to keep Elijah for a few days. It would only be temporary, she said, just until Elena was back on her feet. Elena argued over the phone. "Bring him with you," she pleaded. "I don't like this." Marisol insisted everything would be fine. On morning May 4th, 2021, Marisol left Mesa Verde before sunrise. She kissed Elijah's forehead while he slept. Darius later said the boy barely stirred. 4 days later, Marisol awoke in her mother's spare bedroom to a stream of missed calls. When she finally answered, Darius's voice sounded panicked. "Elijah's gone," he said. At first, she thought she had misheard him. Gone where? Darius told her that a woman had come to the apartment that morning. He claimed the woman said she was Adrian's cousin and that she was there to pick Elijah up for a prearranged visit. Darius said Marisol had mentioned that someone might come by at some point, though she had not given specifics. He claimed he believed it was legitimate. According to his version, he turned his back for a moment to grab Elijah's small backpack. When he looked again, the woman was already walking down the exterior stairs with Elijah in her arms. He tried to call Marisol immediately. She did not answer right away. By the time she called back, he said, the woman was gone. Marisol felt the room spin. She told him she never scheduled a pickup, not that day, not for any day. Darius insisted there must have been a misunderstanding. He said the woman seemed confident, calm. He said she refused the backpack, stating they had everything Elijah needed. Marisol called 911 from Prescott Valley. She began the drive back to Mesa Verde almost immediately, hands shaking on the steering wheel. The desert highway blurred past her as dread settled into her chest. Law enforcement officers arrived at Desert Palms Suites around 7:30 a.m. They questioned Darius in the parking lot. He repeated the story. He described the alleged woman vaguely: medium height, dark hair, no vehicle description, no license plate, no direction of travel beyond down the stairs. Without a confirmed abductor identity or vehicle, authorities hesitated to issue a statewide child abduction alert. The case, they said initially, appeared to be a possible custodial dispute. They advised that more information was needed. Hours passed before an official missing child report was widely circulated. Marisol arrived in Mesa Verde by mid-afternoon. She ran through the apartment calling Elijah's name. His toy cars were still scattered on the carpet. His small shoes were by the door. Nothing appeared packed or prepared for a visit. She gave statements to police. At first, she denied ever suggesting that anyone would pick Elijah up. Later, under pressure, she admitted that she and Darius had argued before she left for Prescott Valley. In frustration, she had said something along the lines of, "Maybe his dad's family should just come get him." She claimed it was said out of anger, not as an actual plan. The contradiction did not go unnoticed. News outlets picked up the story within a day. Photos of Elijah in a bright yellow t-shirt began circulating online. Volunteers gathered in small search groups, combing nearby vacant lots and alleyways. Flyers were taped to light poles. Elena watched coverage from her living room in Prescott Valley, her injured leg propped up on pillows. She felt sick with guilt for not insisting harder that Elijah come with Marisol. Meanwhile, suspicion slowly shifted. Detectives revisited the apartment. They noticed inconsistencies in Darius's timeline. Neighbors reported no unusual visitors that morning. Security cameras at a nearby convenience store showed no woman matching the description carrying a child. The kidnapping narrative, once urgent and alarming, began to fray at the edges. And as the days stretched on without a confirmed sighting, the question quietly formed in the minds of investigators and community members alike. If no one came to take Elijah, then what really happened inside that apartment at Desert Palm Suites? By early spring, professionals were circling the family again. After the domestic incident with Mark Ellis, the referral from the Regional Health Board meant that multiple agencies were now aware of concerns about Erin Walsh and her daughters. A strategy meeting was held over video call. Representatives from social services, early years education, and community health attended. On paper, the risk factors were clear: a recent violent partner, a history of instability, a cluttered home environment, and a mother who seemed overwhelmed. But risk on paper does not always translate into decisive action. When community health visitor Sarah Llewellyn first stepped through the front door of the small terrace in Glenford, she was struck by two competing impressions. The house smelled stale, with a faint sourness of old rubbish and damp clothes. Toys were scattered across the living room floor. Laundry overflowed from a basket near the stairs. An unwashed bottle sat on the coffee table beside a half-finished can of cola. And yet, tucked between the mess were signs of childhood. A bright poster of cartoon animals on the wall, a row of tiny Wellington boots by the door, crayon drawings taped carefully to the fridge. Mia, just over 2 years old, stood near the sofa clutching a stuffed rabbit. She watched Sarah with wide, cautious eyes. Her older sister, Ava, hovered protectively nearby. Erin seemed tired. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She apologized repeatedly for the state of the house, explaining that she was in the middle of sorting it all out. She spoke quickly, sometimes jumping from one topic to another. She said she was done with Mark. She said she was focusing on the girls. She said she just needed a bit of help. Sarah completed her assessment: general safety of the home, food in the cupboards, sleeping arrangements, the children's appearance. There was food available. The girls were dressed appropriately, if not perfectly clean. No obvious injuries were visible. Mia was shy but responsive when spoken to. The conclusion from that first visit was cautious optimism. Erin was offered support through a parenting program and signposted to counseling services. A follow-up appointment was scheduled. The case was categorized as child in need rather than child protection, a distinction that would shape everything that followed. Over the next few months, Erin's engagement fluctuated. Sometimes she answered the door and spoke at length about her plans to tidy the house, find part-time work, and get back on her feet. Other times she missed appointments. She would text later with explanations: a sick child, a forgotten date, exhaustion. The house remained inconsistent. On one visit, the kitchen counters were clear and the floor recently mopped. On another, rubbish bags had piled near the back door and dishes filled the sink. Then, in late summer, Aaron met someone new. His name was Ryan Carter. He was introduced to friends as a fresh start. He worked sporadically in construction and had a loud, confident presence. Neighbors noticed him almost immediately. He smoked outside the house late into the night. His voice carried down the narrow street when he argued on the phone. Aaron described him to Sarah as supportive and helpful. She said he fixed things around the house and helped with the girls. She said he made her feel safe. Sarah reminded her gently about the importance of taking things slowly when children were involved. Aaron nodded. She insisted everything was fine. Within weeks, Ryan was staying overnight regularly. Ava, now 6, mentioned casually during a school well-being session that Mummy's friend shouts a lot. The school noted the comment but had little detail to act on. Ava did not seem withdrawn or frightened in class. She was bright and chatty, fond of reading corner time and playground games. Mia, meanwhile, had started nursery part-time. Staff described her as quiet but affectionate. She loved the dress-up area and would often choose sparkly costumes, twirling until she felt dizzy. Occasionally, she arrived with minor bumps or bruises, the kind common in toddlers. When asked, she would shrug or say she fell. Nothing on its own triggered escalation. Behind closed doors, however, tension had returned to the household. Ryan had a temper that flared quickly. He disliked noise, he disliked clutter, he disliked what he called chaos. Aaron, already stretched thin, tried to keep the house neater to avoid conflict. She urged the girls to be quiet. She cleaned late at night. Neighbors later recalled raised voices, a thud once, a slammed door. But in terraced housing, noise travels in fragments. It is hard to distinguish ordinary arguments from something more serious. In early autumn, Sarah conducted another scheduled visit. Ryan was present. He answered the door with a tight smile. Aaron hovered behind him. The atmosphere felt different. The house was noticeably tidier than before, almost unnaturally so. Toys were stacked neatly in plastic bins. Surfaces were cleared. Windows were open despite the chill. Mia sat on the sofa, unusually subdued. Sarah asked routine questions. Aaron answered, often glancing toward Ryan as if checking for approval. Ryan interjected occasionally, describing how he had taken charge of organizing the home. He spoke confidently about discipline and routine. When Sarah asked about Mia's recent nursery absences, Ryan explained that the child had been under the weather and that they preferred to keep her home rather than expose other children to illness. Sarah made notes. She did not see visible marks. Mia avoided eye contact, but responded softly when asked about nursery, mentioning painting and snack time. There was a brief moment when Mia lifted her sleeve to scratch her arm. Sarah noticed a faint yellowing bruise near the elbow. She asked gently how it happened. "She's clumsy," Ryan replied quickly. Mia nodded. The visit concluded without escalation. Sarah documented her observations, including the bruise and the change in household dynamic. The case remained open under support services, but it was not moved to a higher risk category. Over the next month, nursery staff observed subtle changes. Mia became more withdrawn. She flinched once when another child raised a toy too quickly near her. She began clinging to staff at drop-off, crying in a way that seemed more anxious than before. A safeguarding lead at the nursery requested a check-in call with Aaron. The conversation was brief. Aaron sounded distracted. She assured them Mia was fine, just going through a phase. Meanwhile, social services were managing dozens of other families with more overt indicators of harm: missed medical appointments, visible injuries, police call-outs. Resources were stretched. Cases were triaged by severity. Mia's case sat in the middle, concerning but not acute. Then came the first clear fracture in the narrative. One afternoon, Ava confided in a teaching assistant that she didn't like when Ryan gets cross at Mia. When asked what she meant, Ava hesitated. She said he sent Mia to her room a lot. She said he shouted close to her face. She said once Mia cried for a long time. The school logged the disclosure and made a referral to social services. A strategy discussion followed. The existing involvement with the family meant records were already available. The question was whether this new information shifted the risk threshold. A joint home visit was arranged. When the social worker and a police officer arrived, Ryan was not home. Erin appeared nervous but cooperative. She insisted there was no physical harm. She admitted that Ryan could be strict, but said he cared about her girls. Mia was examined by a pediatric nurse as a precaution. No acute injuries were identified at that time. The bruising visible was consistent with minor childhood knocks, according to the assessment. Without concrete evidence of physical harm, the response again centered on increased monitoring rather than removal. Erin agreed to attend a domestic abuse awareness course. Ryan agreed, reluctantly, to meet with a family support worker. On paper, safeguards were in place. In reality, the dynamics behind the door were tightening. Ryan resented the scrutiny. He blamed Erin for letting outsiders interfere. Arguments became more frequent. Erin, feeling trapped between defending her partner and protecting her children, began to withdraw from professionals. She missed 2 consecutive support appointments. Phone calls went unanswered. Nursery staff noticed Mia arrived one morning with a small mark near her collarbone. When asked, she whispered that she fell off the sofa. The explanation was plausible. Still, the pattern of small injuries and behavioral changes formed a mosaic that was growing harder to ignore. Another referral was made. By this point, the file on the Walsh family had grown thick with notes, observations, and partial concerns. No single entry screamed emergency. Together, they suggested instability. The system was watching. It was documenting. It was intervening in measured steps. But whether those steps were enough remained an open question. As autumn deepened and evenings darkened earlier each day, professionals involved with the family felt a quiet unease. The pieces did not fully align, yet they did not sit comfortably either. Mia, once described as bubbly and mischievous, now rarely smiled during visits. She stayed close to her sister. She spoke softly. And still, without definitive proof of escalating harm, the case remained balanced precariously between support and protection. The next call would change that balance. By early spring, concerns about the family had become more difficult to ignore. What had once been described as a chaotic but loving household was increasingly characterized by visible strain, social isolation, and escalating tension. Professionals involved with the family had differing interpretations of what they were seeing. Some viewed the situation as one shaped primarily by poverty, stress, and limited coping skills. Others were beginning to question whether the environment posed a more direct risk to the children. The relationship between Marissa and her partner, Kyle, had grown volatile. While there had been previous reports of domestic disturbances in Marissa's earlier relationships, this new dynamic unfolded during a period when many services were operating remotely and home visits were limited. That shift reduced the frequency of direct observation and made it harder to assess what daily life inside the home truly looked like. School staff noticed subtle changes in Ava's behavior. Once outgoing and eager to participate, she became withdrawn and easily startled. She complained more frequently of stomach aches and headaches. On one occasion, a staff member noted bruising that did not match the explanation provided. The incident was documented, but it did not immediately trigger a formal child protection conference. The explanation, though thin, was not conclusively disproven. Meanwhile, community health practitioners attempted to re-engage Marissa in parenting support services. Appointments were missed, phone calls went unanswered. When contact was made, Marissa appeared defensive, insisting that outside agencies were exaggerating minor issues and unfairly judging her. She described feeling overwhelmed and scrutinized. The professionals involved recorded her emotional distress, but the case remained categorized as support needed rather than immediate safeguarding risk. The critical turning point came when emergency services were called to the home following a medical crisis involving Ava. Despite resuscitation efforts, she did not survive. The immediate shock rippled through the community. Neighbors who had heard raised voices in the past expressed regret that they had not acted sooner. Extended family members struggled to reconcile the cheerful child they remembered with the devastating outcome. Law enforcement initiated a full investigation. Medical examiners determined that the cause of death was consistent with non-accidental trauma. The findings contradicted the initial account provided by the adults in the home. Kyle was arrested and later charged with murder. Marissa was charged with causing or allowing the death of a child, a serious offense reflecting a failure to protect. The criminal proceedings that followed were closely watched. Prosecutors presented evidence of escalating violence within the household, including digital communications and testimony describing prior incidents of aggression. They argued that Kyle's actions were deliberate and that Marissa had either known or should have known that her child was at risk. Defense counsel countered that Marissa herself was subject to coercive control and manipulation, suggesting she lacked the autonomy or awareness necessary to intervene effectively. Expert witnesses discussed the dynamics of abusive relationships, emphasizing how intimidation and isolation can impair a caregiver's judgment. However, the court ultimately concluded that the risk to Ava had been foreseeable. Kyle was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Marissa was convicted of causing or allowing her daughter's death and received a substantial custodial sentence. Beyond the courtroom, a statutory safeguarding review was commissioned. Such reviews are not designed to assign criminal blame, but to analyze systemic performance. The panel examined records from health services, social care, education providers, and law enforcement. Their mandate was to determine whether opportunities to intervene had been missed and what reforms might prevent similar tragedies. The review identified several themes. First, there had been fragmented information sharing. Multiple agencies held partial concerns, but no single professional had a complete picture. Each individual concern, viewed in isolation, appeared manageable. Taken together, they suggested a trajectory of escalating risk. The absence of a coordinated multi-agency meeting at a critical juncture meant those patterns were not synthesized in time. Second, the shift to remote engagement during public health restrictions limited the ability of professionals to observe the home environment. Video calls cannot fully replicate in-person assessment. Subtle nonverbal cues, environmental hazards, and relational dynamics are harder to detect through a screen. While remote services were necessary under the circumstances, the review concluded that higher-risk households should have been prioritized for safe, direct contact whenever possible. Third, practitioners may have over-relied on parental self-reporting. Marissa's assurances that the situation was under control were documented repeatedly. Although professionals noted inconsistencies, they hesitated to escalate without definitive proof. The review emphasized that safeguarding decisions must weigh patterns of concern rather than waiting for a single catastrophic event. Fourth, there was insufficient exploration of the impact of domestic abuse on parenting capacity. While previous incidents had triggered referrals, the long-term implications were not continuously reassessed. Research consistently demonstrates that exposure to domestic violence significantly increases the risk of harm to children, both directly and indirectly. The review recommended enhanced training to help practitioners identify coercive control and understand its implications for child safety. The report also addressed broader structural issues. High caseloads and staffing shortages limited the depth of engagement possible with each family. Documentation requirements consumed significant time, reducing capacity for proactive intervention. The panel stopped short of assigning blame to individual workers, recognizing the complexity of the environment in which they operated. In response, the local authority implemented several reforms. Multi-agency safeguarding hubs were strengthened to ensure real-time information sharing. Threshold criteria for child protection conferences were clarified to reduce ambiguity about escalation. Training programs were updated to emphasize cumulative risk assessment rather than incident-based evaluation. Community outreach initiatives were expanded as well. Public awareness campaigns encouraged neighbors and extended family members to report concerns without fear of overreacting. Schools introduced additional pastoral support for students displaying behavioral changes. Health visitors were given revised protocols for follow-up when appointments were repeatedly missed. Ava's extended family established a small charitable fund in her memory. Its purpose was to support early intervention programs and provide resources for families experiencing domestic abuse. They described it as a way to transform grief into action. While no initiative could reverse what had happened, they hoped it might protect other children. The case also reignited national debate about how societies balance parental rights with child protection. Some commentators argued that intervention thresholds remain too high, allowing risk to escalate unchecked. Others cautioned against overly intrusive state involvement in family life. Policymakers acknowledged the tension but agreed that clearer accountability and better coordination were essential. For professionals in the safeguarding field, the case became a somber teaching example. Training materials highlighted missed signals and decision points. Practitioners were encouraged to ask themselves difficult questions. Are we seeing the whole picture? Are we minimizing patterns because each individual incident seems minor? Are we adequately considering the cumulative effect of domestic instability on a child's safety? The most enduring lesson was that safeguarding rarely fails because of one dramatic oversight. It more often falters through incremental normalization of concern. Each missed appointment, each plausible explanation, each delayed escalation can feel defensible in isolation. Over time, however, those small decisions compound. In the years following the convictions, policy adjustments and training reforms aimed to close those gaps. Whether such measures can fully prevent future tragedies remains uncertain. Child protection operates in a domain of inherent unpredictability, shaped by human behavior, limited resources, and competing priorities. Yet the commitment to continuous improvement remains central to the system's purpose. Ava's life, though brief, left a lasting impact on those who knew her. Teachers remembered her early enthusiasm in class. Relatives recalled her imagination and humor. The community's collective grief underscored a shared responsibility. The protection of children cannot rest solely on individual parents or single agencies. It requires vigilance, collaboration, and the willingness to act decisively when patterns of risk emerge. The final safeguarding review closed with a statement that has since been quoted in professional circles. Early curiosity saves lives. Curiosity in this context does not mean suspicion without cause. It means a disciplined commitment to explore inconsistencies, to connect fragmented information, and to prioritize the welfare of the child above procedural convenience. That principle now guides the revised protocols developed in the aftermath of the case. It stands as a reminder that systems are only as effective as their ability to learn from failure. While nothing can undo the loss suffered, the hope is that sustained attention to these lessons will strengthen protective frameworks for other vulnerable children. The tragedy reshaped policy discussions, professional training, and community awareness. It remains a stark example of how domestic instability, systemic strain, and fragmented communication can converge with devastating consequences. And it continues to challenge institutions and individuals alike to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility, intervention, and the limits of oversight in private family life. In the end, the lasting impact of the case may be measured not only in legal judgments or procedural reforms, but whether future warning signs are recognized earlier and addressed with greater resolve. Safeguarding is, at its core, a collective endeavor. Its success depends on vigilance, transparency, and the courage to intervene when a child's safety is at stake.